Nik went a little bit viral on his essay, Why I No Longer Recommend a RAG for Autonomous Agents. I think the idea here is that retrieval is supposed to sharpen your coding agent's ability to have memory and do all this stuff. But really, it seems like everyone has come to the conclusion that for these agentic use cases around code generation, embedding search, RAG, is no longer something that is being recommended by a lot of people. Nik is the head of AI at Klein, one of the open source coding agents. I think it's like millions now of downloads on VS Code. And so if you want to check that out, it's Cline.bot. I think your essay really sparked a lot of conversation on Twitter about RAG being dead. And I feel like this is going to be a fun way to sort of respond to some of that conversation as well. I'm really excited for you to share a little bit more and then go into questions afterwards. Nik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason. I've been following you for a while actually, and I'm a big fan. More than anything, I think you're a smart guy, and I think I really enjoy the way that you write. I think writing is such like an under-emphasized skill these days, and that's like one of the main reasons I appreciate you and why I enjoy the timeline, following you on the timeline. So yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to come chat. So yeah, my article on the death of RAG, why I no longer recommend RAG for autonomous coding agents, it caused a little bit of a stir, and I kind of want to dive into what sparked all of this. What actually sparked initially why I initially wrote that article is because I was in I was in a call um, with this enterprise that they were searching for their agentic coding tool that they were going to use, and they were going through a procurement process. And one of the products they were looking at was Klein. And I happened to be in this meeting with one of our sales guys. We were talking to this company. They're a very big company with thousands of engineers. And their decision-making process was remarkably naive, in my opinion, where it was almost like they were going through a checklist, like, hey, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? And one of the questions they asked was, hey, do you guys do RAG? And to me, I was like, it was like such a weird question to me, but like they were like considering this as like part of their requirements. And essentially, like in the meeting, I asked them like, "Hey, like, why? Why do you guys want this? Like, are you guys sure you actually want this?" And the answer they gave me was like, "Well, isn't it good for large coding, like large code bases or something?" So that kind of prompted me to write this article where kind of put all the thoughts that we're thinking about internally at Klein and thoughts that I've been thinking for a while, to articulate them and actually write them down. And the article kind of blew up on Twitter, on X, and kind of started this discussion in the whole industry. So let's kind of dive into it. So the original promise of RAG, back in like 2023, you had it was kind of like a gold rush with all of these vector database companies like Pinecone. And they famously came out with like this thing called the OP stack, which is like the OpenAI Pinecone stack. This is like way back in the day. And they position themselves like, hey, we give long-term memory to your AI. Back then, context windows are very narrow, very short, and they promise to kind of ground responses in real documents and real data, saving, reducing hallucinations, pairing models with like vector database. They kind of claimed that they were going to simulate long-term memory for these agents. So all of a sudden, and this is like a lot of buzzwords around the time where he's like, oh, like you have an infinite context window now. Now that you have RAG, it's like a one size fits all solution. Now you have infinite memory. And then another claim that they made was that instead of training on very kind of like fine tuning on your specific use case, you could now plug your own data and get accurate answers out of the box. So everyone invested in this promise, from Andreessen Horowitz to Sequoia to Menlo Ventures to Benchmark Capital. I could go down the list. And not all the money obviously went to Pinecone. You had other vector databases like Weaviate, Chroma, Qdrant, and like hundreds of others. So, at the time it was like very clear, like there's a lot of investor interest in this. A lot of people are invested in this story and this promise. And I think that's part of the reason why when I wrote my article, there was a lot of this, it was almost like sunk cost fallacy, where like a lot of these people that were deeply invested came out of the woodwork and kind of were responding. Um, so I will say back in the day, it actually worked. I ended up building Vault, which was a popular open source project at the time, to help people ingest thousands of documents, create their own knowledge bases, and get structured outputs. Um, I actually ended up making a little demo website for this open source project called Vault. And immediately my servers were blowing up. I had tons of people just using the website, even though I was strongly pushing everyone to like, hey, just go set this code up yourself. It's open source. Most people ended up using the website. Immediately, I burned through my like $250 OpenAI quote at the time. And actually my servers ended up crashing because of the load. So I ended up like building all these systems to handle scaling, added a subscription layer on top of it to actually charge people, because I wasn't going to front the cost for it. If they really wanted to use the website, they were going to have to pay me for it. Started getting thousands of subscribers on this Vault website. And actually I had a number of AI companies reach out to me to ask me like, hey, how do we build RAG? How do we improve our RAG pipelines? And that led me into like consultation for a lot of recently funded AI startups. And I really became a professional. Like I know the ins and outs of RAG. I know what it takes to improve a RAG pipeline. It's a fundamentally non-deterministic system. So the way you go about improving it is non-trivial. Um, a lot of people came to me and they were like, hey, it feels like it's not working very well. How do I improve this? And, then you go down the rabbit hole of, well, okay, what data are you collecting on your RAG pipeline? Are you collecting cosine similarity scores? Do you have a re-ranker? Are you collecting re-ranker scores? And then going into the art of improving RAG applications. Yeah, and Jason has written a lot about this. And I'm pretty much on the same page. It really is an art form. There's a lot that goes into it. And if you really do need it, it's worth it. But I no longer recommend RAG for coding agents specifically. And at Klein, I became like the number one advocate against using RAG, actually, even though, RAG has been my bread and butter for so long. I'm just like actively anti-RAG at Klein. And I think in general, for any coding agent, company, startup, we're all thinking about the same things here in the industry. And let's dive into it. So this was the article that I wrote. I have a link here in the slides, but it was called Why I No Longer Recommend RAG for Autonomous Coding Agents. I wrote this in May, and I talk about all the things that I'm going to be talking about in this talk at kind of like a more broad bubble. And, the essential thesis is that RAG isn't needed for coding agents. So code is inherently logical and structured. I mean, hopefully your code is logical and structured. You don't need to index your whole code base anymore, which is a massive security nightmare. You could actually reverse an embedding and get the original contents of it. So it's not actually like, a lot of people consider it like secure, like it's like some kind of hash of your data, and it really isn't. You can reverse engineer any embedding and pretty much get the original contents. And you got to store all these embeddings somewhere. If you're not storing them locally, then you have to keep them updated. Then you have to improve your RAG pipelines and go into that whole process of cosine similarity scores and collecting this data and improving it. You can also just ask your coding agent, like Klein in this case, to find the relevant code And kind of like in these screenshots, I'm showing like a real example. Like literally yesterday, I was using Cline to look into some GitHub issue that someone mentioned, and we had this discussion in our Slack, and I copy and pasted the whole discussion in the Slack where there was like a link to the original code that was problematic. And I gave it to Klein, and Klein just started going through, and I told Klein like, hey, you have access to the GH terminal command. You can go ahead and use that. And with access to the terminal, Klein could basically grep and use GH to pull in the link, read through the original diff of the original PR that caused the bug, look through the code that's current, use grep to find anything else. And Klein went through, came up with a plan to fix it, and I just switched to act mode, and Klein went ahead and fixed the issue for me. And this is a very common life cycle of a coding agent task where you have a plan mode and then you have an act mode. And it's this plan and act paradigm that's becoming more and more popular. With Klein, we actually introduced this plan and act paradigm, and we're starting to see a lot of other coding agents follow suit. So recently, I think famously, Claude Code added a plan and act mode. So this is like becoming a common pattern for coding agents. And the plan mode is basically all of the data gathering necessary, all bringing everything in context that's necessary to solve the problem. And you'll notice that RAG isn't really a part of any of this. Oh, and really quick, just backing up a little bit. When I'm talking about RAG, I'm talking about what the original, like, I know the term has been co-opted a little bit, and I got a lot of criticism about my article, even though I clarified this a number of times, that RAG is just any retrieval augmented generation. So like even this, you're still doing RAG technically. That's a very common response that I hear. And I'm specifically talking about embedding search. I'm specifically talking about indexing and embeddings and cosine similarity and re-rankers and that kind of thing. And what most people in the industry that were invested in this narrative and Pinecone and all of these people, like all of those articles that I referenced, they were all talking about this form of RAG. So when I say RAG, I'm talking about embeddings. And you'll notice that embedding search isn't a part of this at all, right? You might use the terminal to use grep. You might search the code base using various tools, read file tool. What we do at Klein is we give Klein like an overarching view of the file tree, as well as some like basic AST info. And Klein just goes through and reads files, uses grep and basic, like what basically an engineer would do, really. When you show a senior engineer a new code base, what do? They look at the folder structure, they look at the names of the folders, they look at the files. They might read in a file and see like, okay, this file imports this other file. Let's go check out what this other file that it imports has. And then you generally build an understanding using this agentic discovery approach. And, it works remarkably well. Klein just reads things in a context, gets all the information he needs to come up with a robust plan. And you really want to make sure you're investing in that plan phase to come up with a very rock solid plan. And then you're ready to switch into act mode and actually implement. So after I wrote my article, shortly after, Pinecone responded with this article on their page where they're basically like kind of coping, for lack of a better word, with the contents of my article. And they said things like RAG isn't dead, it's critical. They kind of downplayed a lot of my points and didn't really even address me. They just kind of try to like marginalize all the points that I was making. They said the prag isn't RAG, it's you, that you're not using RAG effectively. They said hallucinations. What about hallucinations? Like you need RAG to avoid hallucinations, when it's like hallucinations are like frankly, they're not even a like I've never seen it be a problem working at Klein. Um, because you're reading in all of these files and all of this context that hallucinations hardly ever happen. And also like we set the temperature to zero for like pretty much all of our providers. So that's just like I think that's like a moot point, and I think it's very outdated. And then agentic RAG, they came up with this kind of new buzz term where they said, well, hey, like there's traditional RAG, and like we agree that was bad, but agentic RAG, it's so much better. And they came up with this like diagram um, with like all these like little, like just like to show you like how complex their like their system that they're proposing is like they made it for me. They showed the diagram and like they're showing off this pipeline. And my response to that is basically like, yeah, you're solving 2022 problems with 2023 tech. Everything that they call a limitation, like hallucinations, outdated knowledge, or context limits, it's totally irrelevant today with flagship models and model context protocol, MCP servers. Like, they mentioned like documentation is like, we have MCP for that. We have tools that you can bring in that just pull in the most relevant documentation, the most recent documentation. And essentially RAG is just a bloated workaround for issues that don't really exist anymore in practice. They talk about control, and they frame RAG that it's safer and more trustworthy. But with a coding agent, you don't need citation graphs. You need judgment, and you need just like logical progression reading through the code base. And it improves the agent's execution for the agent to come about and come up with a plan organically instead of having this like schizophrenic mind map of four-dimensional clustered embeddings like floating around in its head. It really is a source of distraction for an agent to run this search. And they proposed agentic RAG to like run this search and just have like a whole bunch of like clusters from all over the place surface of like chunked code that is just like you get like a small snippet of code. And even if you work even if you work like really hard on your chunking algorithm and make sure that like your chunks are like immaculately split up and segmented so you get like perfect functions and it's just like beautiful chunking, even then you're getting chunk surface from all over the code base, and your poor agent is just like dealing with all these chunks, trying to make sense out of it. And it ends up being a fundamental like distraction for your coding agent. That's why I titled this talk like stop distracting your coding agents. Just let them do what they think is necessary and let them follow their own train of thought. We call this at Klein, we call this narrative integrity, where every task is kind of like a story, where it might be a very boring story, but the story makes sense. The story is coherent, where every step of the way, like, hey, Klein, he started out with a task that this like protagonist, which is Klein, this coding agent, needs to overcome. You start with the kind of the setting of the story where Klein is exploring the code base, reading in files in full. We don't even read in like parts of files. We're very context heavy, take in the entire file, load it into context, understand the setting, understand where the story is taking place. And then we come up with a plan on how to overcome the central issue of the story, which is the task that the user came with. And because these LLMs are really good at predicting the next token, if the story makes sense, they can continue the story in a logical way and eventually come to the resolution, which is it solving your task. And frankly, yeah, like this agentic RAG approach that Pinecone proposed, it just sounds like slapping agentic on top of an outdated solution. And it just adds so much complexity. And now you're maintaining the system. And yeah, RAG really is this black hole, and you can sink endless resources into it. and try to have like marginal improvements to your RAG pipeline. And at Klein, I'm just like, what I propose is you just zoom out and take a totally different approach. Drop all of that, remove all of that from your code. If you already have it, just stop maintaining it, stop coping, and just go full agentic. So this kind of leads me into the bitter lesson where famously Boris from Claude Code, I actually found this clip from his Latent Space podcast, which, by the way, myself and Saud, the CEO of Klein, we recently recorded a podcast with Latent Space that's going to be out soon. So we're going to be talking about similar things in that podcast. But Boris was on there from Claude Code. And Boris is like basically like the creator of Claude Code. Claude Code is his brainchild. And even he in this podcast talked about RAG and how they tried it at Claude Code and it was just disappointing. And they found that agentic exploration of the code base just works so much better. And he talks a lot about the bitter lesson where modern models don't really need RAG anymore. You can feed in real files. That RAG just distracts the model, if anything, it just subtracts from the model's intelligence. And it's a maintenance nightmare. He talked a lot about like the security implications of it. And they ended up just throwing it all out after experimenting with RAG, building like an early RAG system. And they just gave access to tools like grep and basic read file functionality, and Claude Code was able to do the rest. So my kind of take on the bitter lesson is that essentially what it means is that the application layer is shrinking. And all of this code that you write, like back in the day, like with traditional ML, you needed like a big harness. You needed like a lot of code to make traditional ML useful for people to actually productize it. With LLMs, you still need a decent amount of code, but it's definitely less now than before. You just kind of hook in some APIs with OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini, and you're able to make something very useful. And the bitter lesson to me, what it really means is that this application layer is just shrinking over time. Every day it's just growing smaller and smaller. And instead of trying to cope with that, and instead of trying to hang on to these systems that you've built, which a lot of engineers I see you doing this, where they're really holding on, they're still maintaining these systems. It really is like a form of like delusion or denial that they're still hanging on to this. But really, yeah, just throw it all out, let the model do its job. Stop trying to get in the way of the model. It's almost like cleaning a mirror and letting more light shine through. Right. And this applies to more than just RAG. And this is like probably a topic for another talk, but I've written about this as well for Fast Apply. I wrote a similar article. This applies to RAG. This applies to Fast Apply. It even applies to fancy static analysis tools, like recently CodeGen. Their whole bread and butter for years was building these like knowledge graphs of code that you could query with like a SQL database or like almost like a SQL query string. And even that, they came out and it was like full capitulation. They came out on the timeline and they were like, yeah, we spent like 2 years building this crazy, like these fancy static analysis tools, these knowledge graphs for code, and a special query language to be able to query it. And we ended up throwing all of it out and just like essentially forking Klein. I don't know if they actually forked Klein, but they ended up just like doing what we're doing now. So, and then the next kind of, the jury's still out on this, but like I'm tentatively on the side that multi-agents and sub-agents, it's going to follow a similar pattern where you're not going to need any of this stuff. You're just going to let the flagship model do its job. So I will give a kind of short disclaimer that's not a disclaimer, where RAG can still be useful. I think RAG can still be useful if you're trying to keep things cheap. If your business model revolves around making money off of inference, RAG can make sense if you're trying to save tokens and squeeze margins. Like if you're trying to like charge like a $20 per month subscription for your users and you're building a coding agent, you'll quickly find that coding agents are very expensive. They're very context heavy. They burn a lot of tokens. And one way you can go about kind of doing a shortcut and saving on some of these costs is using RAG. Instead of reading in entire files, you just kind of have this RAG step and bring things into context that way. And yeah, you get like perfunctory performance. I think Cursor famously employs this strategy. And it makes sense because they charge a $20 per month subscription. We don't do this at Klein from the very beginning. At Klein, we were just bring your own API keys and, you know, use Klein however you like. And we just go full context heavy. And we don't take any shortcuts or any workarounds around context. And we find that it works just so much better for agentic coding. But if you're kind of stuck in this business model where you need to make ends meet and you're charging this flat subscription rate and you have these credits and all this other stuff going on, then RAG can make sense. And also for the traditional use case of like vaults and things that I built in the past, I think it can still make sense for human readable documents, maybe legal documents. But even then, I'm starting to think about like recently I used Klein. I told Klein about like there's this LLMs.txt document somewhere. It was for ADIO. I was trying to hook up some of our systems to the ADIO CRM and have automatic ingestion of accounts. So I gave Klein the LLMs.txt for ADIO, and it's basically it's like all of the documentation for the ADIO API. But unlike a normal LLMs.txt where everything is just in this one site, in this one document, it basically had like a bunch of links to categories of like, okay, here's the person category, here's the company category. And for each one of those, it linked to another markdown document where it would go and have other sections and other API endpoints to explore. And basically I gave Klein this original document. Klein found, it's like, oh, okay, I need to look into the organizations thing, pulled in that link using the Markdownify MCP server. And basically we saw agentic exploration even in a human readable context with like just documentation where you had like a kind of directory list of the high level categories. And if your documents are somewhat hierarchical and you have them in this like logical folder structure, all of the same rules apply. So even there, RAG wasn't needed. But I could see some cases where you have like maybe a massive data lake where it's unstructured and it's just like a whole bunch of human readable text. You know, RAG could be useful there. So that's pretty much that's my talk. I'm happy to open it up for questions. But yeah.
Yeah, I was jumping. It's funny you talk about this PDF case where I think even now for very large data sets, it still makes sense to do like RAG over PDFs. But even now, some of the tools we've been implementing is, when you retrieve a page object from a document field, and then you can still then traverse to a certain document, view a certain page, and then I'll read things that said, oh, this mentions Appendix 162. I'll go to table of contents and then go to page 162 in appendix. And even in those cases, I find that so having this portfolio of tools is still very useful. Maybe RAG is needed in the planning step, but once you are able to implement these, like go to page, go to the next page, go to the table of contents, yeah, you tend to sort of mimic the behavior of these domain experts, right? Which is, again,
Right.
sort of processing data the way that humans are used to processing data. I guess the first question really is like, what do you still recommend RAG for? I think we somewhat answered that, but if you have any other thoughts, I would love to hear them out.
Yeah. Like again, if you need to save costs and you want like perfunctory performance that's not like truly intelligent, that's not like super high quality, for things like I see a lot of like these like review agents on GitHub where they have to review like thousands of PRs, and the cost for that can't really be justifiable in most cases for a lot of the free tiers. It's like, yeah, that can make sense where it's like uses like a basic form of RAG and a smaller model to answer questions, basic questions, and respond to GitHub issues. Um, yeah, like massive data lakes, things like that, it can make sense. So, I wouldn't say it's fully dead, but for intelligent coding agents, for like serious engineering teams, I wouldn't trust my production code base with an agent that uses RAG.
I guess if I play devil's advocate here, what about the situations where even the code base feels like a massive data lake? Like, I'm curious. I don't think I've seen anyone sort of work with agents on like, you know, uh, like I'm really curious what the Google or like the Facebook like mono repo looks like. But I don't know if you have any thoughts there, especially because yeah, even at Facebook,
Yeah.
we had to have like our own grep.
Yeah. I would say like Klein, a lot of these enterprises that are coming to us, we basically like early on, we didn't have any enterprise products.
Mhm.
And we're actually launching our enterprise product like this week. But a few months ago, we didn't have it, and we just like put up a website with like a form where enterprises could go and sign up. And immediately we started getting flooded with like all of these enterprises, and we started getting booking meetings with, you know, Fortune 5 companies, not even 500, but like massive companies with
Right.
like massive engineering teams and massive code bases coming to us saying like, hey, we already have hundreds of engineers using Klein in our organization because you guys are open source and we pass like the security audits, like really easy to use Klein at these organizations. And they're like, this is a fire that we need to put out. This is like actually really bad because we have no idea which API keys our engineers are using, like where they're sending their data, how much money they're spending. We have no control over this. Please just give us an enterprise product. Let us give you money to make an enterprise product so that we can actually manage this. And all of them say that Klein works remarkably well in massive code bases with the basic tools that Klein already has. And one of these things is like grep. If you have your own form of grep, like at Meta or whatever, you can just either hook in an MCP server for that or give it a special Klein rules file that explains like how to use this tool in the terminal, so that Klein just knows it out of the box. And we also do like these like basic like folder structures, and a tree view for Klein, and like basically is like some basic AST stuff. And Klein just handles all of that very well. And if you give it like a starting point, then even better, Klein can find what it's working with a lot faster. So you're basically just trying to reduce that planning phase time down, to where Klein can more quickly figure out like where the relevant stuff is. And really that part is fairly trivial, even in a very large code base.
That's good to hear. I guess this question, it's almost baked into two parts, but can knowledge graphs or other forms of indexing help me ditch RAG in terms of vector databases for non-coding use cases? I have my general thoughts there, but I'm curious where your head is at for things like this, knowledge graphs.
Yeah, like what's remarkable to me is like, I was on the knowledge graph team at Meta, and like I was bullish for a long time for like using knowledge graphs for code and in these agentic workflows. But like I said, like code gen, like literally yesterday, the code gen founder Jay Hack came out and said like, hey, our whole bread and butter is like building these knowledge graphs for code. And we've been trying to build a coding agent using it, and it's just like it just worked terribly. Like we just threw it all out. And if they overcame like all of this work, and they themselves said that it didn't work, like I'm starting to think again about knowledge graphs in general. So I think the jury's still out, but it's not looking
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. On my side, I feel like the harder thing is that if you write code, the AST is a well-defined knowledge graph that is very lindy across many like decades. Whereas if you're building your own custom system, you needed to define this taxonomy. And I think the jury's out on whether or not that your team is aware enough of the problem to actually build the right syntax, right? But if you know exactly how things are being used and exactly how things are being traversed, it does make sense. But I just generally think it's hard to find people who are good at modeling things that way. Um, to this point, I'm also curious, what is your experience with using the AST and the syntax trees for these coding agents? Like, does Klein have access to this kind of information?
Klein does have access to this information, and then Klein even has a tool that you can use that uses like this like AST to list like code definitions and things like that. And frankly, Klein doesn't really use it that often, and it's not actually like used like a lot, or and it's not very necessary. I'd say in some cases it can be helpful, but in most cases it's like, hey, if you need to find a code definition, you have the imports at the top of the file, you can go and find it. So even that, might end up dying out to this bitter lesson concept. And one last note on knowledge graphs is, I think another kind of problem with it is that these models aren't really trained to use these tools. These models, they're trained to do like the standard coding agent stuff, but they're not really trained to use like your custom knowledge graph. So maybe like if these models are trained for that use case, you can see better performance. But out of the box, I don't think it's going to be as good.
That makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes I always feel like the agent is using the arguments wrong. I just wish it had some access to like that language server to figure out like what is the definition of this if you know you're gonna write a function and like put in the prompt. But yeah, I can imagine like as Claude Code sort of gets all the data out of Sonnet 4 to fine tune, Sonnet 4 will just become better, and then all coding agents that use things like Sonnet will just improve over time. Um, oh, here's a good question. What is your recommendation on maintaining context in long-running coding agent tasks? Uh, I'm really specifically curious about you, like whether or not you believe in like compacting threads.
Yeah. So in Klein, we have a few slash commands you can use. You can use the small slash command to compact. Another thing you could do is slash new task, which I use a lot actually, where you can basically do this task handoff process where it's like if you're starting to approach the capacity of a token context window, you can run slash new task, and Klein basically comes up with like a summary of everything that was done so far, like as you would to a new engineer that's just like taking the task from here onwards, passing off the context to a brand new task and doing context management that way. And at Klein, we had a big blog post where we wrote about like our like before summarization. What we kind of did by default was this like very algorithmic way of truncating context where we would remove like duplicate file reads.
Yep.
We would really try to maintain narrative integrity and clean up the context that way. And what we're finding now is that actually like, yeah, summarization just like works better. And you can like in our internal testing, you can just like have these like long running tasks with like resets of the context window like many times over with just like a very detailed summary. And Claude Code, Boris from Claude Code said the same thing in his talk. So I think surprisingly, the better lesson also applies to context management. I think like all of our clever ideas about like truncation and context management is starting to pan out that basic summarization works really well. And especially internally, we're testing like to-dos, like we're doing it a little bit differently. We have our own kind of way of doing it. And it's been looking very impressive actually, where we get even better performance than like Claude Code for very long running tasks where you can just like one shot like a very long running task if you have summarization as well as like a little scratch pad with to-dos where the agent can just like mark off what it's done and what is left to do, kind of keeping it on track that way.
Yeah, one thing I'll always also say is the performance difference between asking for some piece of code to be written and just doing like any amount of test-driven development, I get like massively different results. Right? It's one of them to say, okay, like implement this new feature, maintain backwards compatibility, versus implement this feature, here's a script, and you run it and it fails, you've done something wrong. Like that's the difference between sort of like supervising something versus like actually coming back in 20 minutes and knowing that the thing still works with summarization. That has been a huge thing as well. Um, let's go to the next question. What's your take on RAG when not applied to coding agents? For example, large enterprise document corpuses to chat with in QA against like RFPs and whatnot. I think we generally answer this. It is very much the case that for like large data sets, RAG is a different use case. But even then, I have been seeing, again, just it's not about whether or not you use embedding search or not. It's just whether or not it makes sense for your budget of latency, cost, and performance. And there has been a lot of contexts now where we have tools to do semantic search to build the initial context. And then afterwards, we have tools for traversal, right? Once we know that these 7 PDFs out of the 1 million PDFs about this construction building are important, and then it becomes things like read the next page or like go to the link or like revisit chapter 7. Those things have been really, really valuable. Cool. Let's keep going down some of these questions. As I'm scanning some of these, I'm curious, what is a question you feel like people are not asking in the coding age world? I'm gonna, that's how I take you a couple seconds to think about that while I scan over some of these questions.
Yeah, one question that I think a lot of people aren't asking is, what's better, a team of geniuses working together or a bunch of solo geniuses working separately in isolation? And this kind of goes back to sub agents and multi-agents. And, we've seen examples of uh, geniuses, human geniuses in the past where breakthroughs just come from one person and they come up with incredible ideas entirely on their own. And then you give it to maybe like a team to implement those ideas. But for like by and all, I think like in general, I'm on the side of like solo geniuses working in isolation. And I think that applies to coding agents. Like I think this whole like multi-agent thing, like, oh, I spun up a gorillion sub agents to like handle this task. I think you're just gonna like we've had this in the past, like with Auto GPT. And back in the day, it was like Auto GPT and Crew AI came out, and that was like also the promise of Crew AI is like, oh, like context windows are limited.
Yep.
We can have a crew of agents work on a problem together. And it seemed like it was very appealing, but it just never worked. Like it was just like, it was like a fast way to burn a whole bunch of tokens and get nowhere. So yeah, and I think it's just like a repeat of like there's so many parallels to the RAG narrative with this like multi-agent thing that I don't know, the jury's still out on that, but I'm kind of on the side of like, just like keep it single threaded, keep it one agent. For things like maybe like read only, it might make sense if you're like just gathering things in a context. But even there, it's like you have the Anthropic research mode in Claude, and then you have the OpenAI research mode. And Anthropic uses multi-agents, OpenAI doesn't. And OpenAI just works so much better for me when I use it for like, deep research for my articles, find like quote mining and things like that. It's just like so much better than Anthropic, and they take like roughly the same amount of time. So I don't know, jury's still out, but yeah.
I think this is a good question. What's your view on servicing Bash CLI tools versus using things like MCP servers?
I think with CLI tools, like it's just like a very easy tool that you can give your agent access to, and it just works. And the agent can decide himself what tools to use. With MCP, I think there's some cases where it can make sense. Like there's some really notable examples, like the magic MCP server from 21st Dev where they inject like taste into the context of the model, where they have this like massive library. It's like a bunch of design engineers that came up with like all these beautiful components and have like a big repository of it. And this MCP basically like pulls in examples of beautiful design of like code or like beautiful components into the conversation and injects some taste into the agent so that the agent can make beautiful components for you. I think there's some good use cases for MCPs, but also like the more MCPs you add, the worse the agent gets at following any one given tool. So we've seen like that's actually one of the limitations with Anthropic's models is like there's only so many MCPs you can add before it just like kind of dilutes everything. Whereas with Gemini is actually much stronger. You can actually give it a lot of MCP servers, and Gemini will start using them effectively.
That makes sense. I guess like another question I'm curious about is when I look at something like Claude Code, it has every single tool in the CLI listed out. So there is a like list directories tool, and there is a, you know, read file tool, and then there is a GitHub tool versus, one can imagine just exposing Bash to it and having a single tool that does many things. I'm curious in your experience, like how do you think about having like super tools versus having smaller task specific tools? I think this is like something I think a lot about for any kind of agent.
Yeah, and like Klein and Cloud Code are similar in this way, where both Klein and Cloud Code, we have a terminal tool where the agent can just run any grep command in the terminal and get its output. But then we also have like the read file tool or like the search directory tool or like these other tools. And I think one element of this is just UX. So, in Klein, I think I might even be able to show you here. Yeah, like on this slide, you might see like Klein wants to read this file. If you have a special tool for it, then you can have like all this custom UX around it. Whereas for all terminal commands, they all look the same. They all look like that little Klein wants to execute this command thing. So on the one hand, there is like the UX component of that. And I personally I think UX is actually very important for this. I think that's one of the reasons why Klein has been so successful is because we just have like such a nice interface for hybrid coding with an AI agent. But we have considered like this internally as well, which is like, hey, what if we just like only use the terminal tool and just like the agent would figure things out from there. I think eventually we might move in that direction. But for the time being, it is helpful to just have like this little sandbox for the agent where it has like these tools like accessible to it. And we know that these tools will work. Whereas like, the agent might misformat, a terminal command or something like that. And there's just like more surface area for problems with the terminal. But I think eventually like we're going to get to a point where none of these tools will be needed.
Yeah. I can only imagine one use case, which is just like having permissions and being able to allow list, right? It's like,
oh yeah. Yeah. That's actually a good point. We have like auto approve settings where it's like, you have to, you can turn on auto approve for reads and edits, but otherwise everything needs approval and like the user can either accept or reject it. Whereas like if the agent's just running terminal commands, like good luck. Right.
Yeah. But I guess that goes down to the UX part again.
Yeah.
As things become more higher stakes, it might be the case that we actually need more tools because we need finer grained access controls versus just having terminal or just running things in a Docker instance. I mean, speaking of terminal, someone asked, is there a plan for a Klein CLI?
Yes. So, I mean, we already have one that we're building. We're actually, we're coming out with Enterprise this week, and we're also coming out with JetBrains and a CLI version of Klein imminently. So we're just kind of tweaking the like we're doing some final polish to make the UX a little bit better for the CLI so that
Mhm.
open source contributors can actually start like contributing to it, and we have like the foundation set for it. But yeah, it's like it really is like cool. The terminal like Klein just feels so awesome, especially when you're like using it in Vim. It's great.
Oh man, I really wish there was some like proper Vim bindings for coding agents. I don't really want to just like multiplex the screen. I want to be able to like make commands and almost have things something in a like a plugin format. I guess on your comment of like the super genius, like one super genius or many super geniuses, what are your thoughts on mixing these models for specific tasks? For example, uh, tools that specifically use Gemini's 1 million context model versus O3 versus Sonnet. Have you thought about what those ergonomics might look like?
Yeah, I think what a lot of like Klein users, like a common pattern a lot of people use is they use a very large context window model like Gemini Pro, the Gemini 2.5 Pro for the planning phase. And then for the act phase, once they've come up with the plan, read it and all of the files into context and come up with a very solid plan, then for the execution phase, they switch to Sonnet 4, for example.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think at Klein, we definitely have a philosophy like we don't want to, be locked to just one model, and our users don't want to be locked to just
Right,
one
right.
model. And not just that, we support all the different providers. We support like Bedrock, Anthropic, OpenAI, whatever you want to use, even self-hosted models. So it's interesting to see these patterns emerge kind of organically. But yeah, I'd say Gemini is really good for large context tasks. So this can be like coming up with a plan for like a massive project. And then Sonnet is very good at this like kind of like almost like autistic execution of like one specific goal, right? So yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I guess. Oh man, I had one more question, but I just forgot it immediately. Unironically, the question was about memory. What are your thoughts on memory? Because I feel like I see Cursor trying to do a memory thing. I don't know. In my opinion, I don't know if I use it that often. Um, Cloud Code has that like exclamation mark or that pound remember versus like the agent files. Um, how do you think about defining a system like that? Because I can imagine that could either be RAG, or that is we just you know like suffix it in the agents.md file and call it a day. So I'm curious how you guys think about that as well.
Yeah, that is a like um I will say like okay, so in Klein we have Klein rules, which is you can consider it like memory or like, things that you just want Klein to know out of the box every time you start a new task. And we see, teams, engineering teams at large enterprises using it this way where, they might have this like kind of custom tribal knowledge that they could like articulate in this Klein rules file. And you can have multiple Klein rules file and toggle them on and off and kind of manage them that way. We also have workflows, which is like uh, more for when you're trying to automate a sequence of repetitive tasks that you previously would do manually with Klein. Now you can just like create a little workflow markdown file where it's like step by step, like, oh, when I'm doing a PR review, first use the GH tool. It's already authenticated. You can use the GH tool to like pull the PR
Mm,
down, review it. Then you can leverage Klein tools as part of this workflow and say like, hey, Klein, use the ask follow-up question tool that you already have access to ask me to make sure like if you want to approve this or not.
yep.
And give a justification for why this PR should be approved or rejected or whatever. And then if I say yes, then go ahead and run the GH tool, GH command to approve it or reject it or whatever. Um, but for this kind of concept of like auto updating memory, like kind of in ChatGPT, they were the first ones that
Yeah.
that came out with this with like the memory updated. Um, yeah, I'm still like in our enterprise product, we're gonna have like a knowledge engine that kind of does some of this stuff.
Mhm.
But you kind of you really got to be careful with this because like oftentimes like even using ChatGPT, it's just like memory updated. It's like, oh, memorized something that I didn't want it remembering, stop doing this. Like
Yeah.
now I have to go in and try and manage it. So there is like a question of like also like really it's like another UX question is like, okay, do we want it automatically updating for users, or do we want user to like have the control over it? Or maybe some kind
Mhm.
of hybrid thing where it like asks for permission to update it and you can like approve it or something.
Yeah.
And for something like that, where it's like your memories start piling up, um, and you start wanting to like doing context management around that, the question is like, okay, well, is RAG good for that? And I'd say maybe, um, maybe it could be, depending on how it's implemented. But it's like if you have like a whole list of like random little memory snippets that's associated with the task that you're working on, maybe embeddings can actually be a good fit there.
Makes a lot of sense. I know we're at time. I want to make sure, I guess they're being held hostage by us for now. But before we go, is there any sort of like where can we find you? Maybe on Twitter or LinkedIn. We'll always send a follow-up email after this, but the floor is yours.
Yeah. So yeah, my name is Nik Pash. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Twitter is like primarily where I post. I also have a Substack. Um, and yeah, I'll just put my at Twitter here in the
I
chat.
am.
But yeah, um, if you have any kind of follow-up questions or any discussion topics you want to talk to me about, just tweet at me and we'll chat there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. On behalf of everyone else, I think we learned a lot today. Excited to show about Klein.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Bye bye.